You'll understand why at the end. But we're going to go ahead and read the scripture reading and have the sermon here from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." The word of God for the people of God. Let all say thanks be to God. Amen. We're going to shift over to use this microphone. That'll be okay. So we are coming to the conclusion, the last time for our sermon series on the 5 practices of fruitful congregations, the book by Bishop Robert Snazy. And today we're going to talk about the practice of extravagant generosity. Now, I made the mistake of listing off all 5 practices at the very first sermon in the midst of this, which means you've had 5 weeks now to know that we were going to be preaching on extravagant generosity, and I'm thankful that anyone is actually here. I thank you very much. But we're going to talk about money. We're going to talk about the tithe. We're going to talk about its importance. We're going to talk about why on earth we would do this, and where does it come from? Well, the idea of giving, and the idea of giving the first fruits, stretches all the way back to Cain and Abel, those first 2 children in the Bible. Cain and Abel, and I'll confess I forget which one was the shepherd and which one was the farmer, but one's dealing with livestock, one's dealing with produce, and they get to the first kind of harvest, if you will, and each of them give to God a portion of what they have, signifying that we ought to be giving to God a portion of what we receive. But for Cain, it seemed to be whatever was left over. And for Abel, it was the first fruits of what he had. And God, we're told, accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's. This is what causes Cain to be so angry at Abel that he goes and he kills him. We are told then that we are to be giving the first fruits, that tithing is kind of that first piece of the budget, and that everything else is to follow that. But that just tells us that we should be giving something. So where on earth does this 10% come from? Well, I'm going to try and make this as short as sweet, but I'm going to tell you the story of where it came from. Abraham was one of the founding fathers of Israel, and so Abraham is sitting there, and he has a nephew named Lot, and they both become very, very rich. They're both shepherds, and they become very, very rich, and their sheep hands begin to argue with each other over grass because there isn't quite enough. And so Abraham says, "Look, Lot, we can't keep living together. There just isn't enough stuff." So they get to this continental divide, and they say, "Look," Abraham says, "Look, Lot, one of us goes one way from here, the other one goes the other way. You pick which way, and I'll go the other way." And so Lot looks out, and he sees a desert to the left, and he sees a lush valley to the right, and he says, "Well, I'm going to go into the lush valley then." And so he heads off to the lush valley, and Abraham heads off to the desert. And Lot goes, and he settles in the largest city in the lush valley, a city named Sodom. And he begins to settle there, and he begins to prosper there. And eventually the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and a few other kings decide it's time for war. And because they were kings and absolute monarchs, no one could tell them it wasn't time for war. And so off they went to war, and they went to battle against a bunch of other kings, and they lost. And those kings come and they sack Sodom, and they take away all of its gold and all of its silver and all of its livestock and most of its people, including Abraham's nephew Lot. Now, Abraham doesn't particularly like this, and so he goes and he hires a bunch of mercenaries, and with a force significantly less than the kings of Sodom had, he goes and he defeats this same army, and he rescues the people of Sodom, and he brings them back. Now, he does not accept any of the gold, any of the silver, any of the livestock, anything as a spoil of war. But before he gives it back to the king of Sodom, he's met by a man named Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is a priest. He is a priest of El Adonai, or priest of God on high, from the city of Salem, which is a city that would eventually become Jerusalem. Salem meaning peace. In other words, Melchizedek is a priest of God on high from Jerusalem. It shouldn't be too hard to figure out who he's supposed to be representing here. And Abraham decides to give 10% of the spoils of war to Melchizedek. And this begins the idea of 10% being the tithe. An idea that would be codified in later on as God is giving instructions in the book of Numbers, the first reading that we read today, where God is telling the Levites, look, all the laity, the other 12 tribes, they're going to give 10% of their harvest, so the first 10% to you. You as the Levites then take all that you get from them, you take 10% of that. The best 10% of that, you give it to the priests. And later on, he'll tell Aaron he'll tell the priests, now you take what you got, and you take 10%, the best 10% of that, and you offer it on the altar to God. So as in the midst of their crops, what they actually grew, only 1/10 of 1% would actually be burned, even though 10% of it was offered to God for the use in God's temple. It's a pretty efficient system, actually. And not only would this be codified in Numbers, it would be redone in Ezekiel after the exile, redone for the second temple, that this was the idea we were supposed to have, that everyone would give 10% of what they got. Be it the lay 12 tribes, be it the Levites, be it the priests, everyone gives 10%. So that tells you what you're to give, that tells you that you're to give, but it doesn't really answer the question, why do we do this, does it? And that, I think, was the question that the people of Israel were starving for when Jesus comes around, because that seems to be the question that Jesus is more interested in than actually giving or an amount. He seems to be more interested in why. And we see that here in the second reading that we had with the widow's offering. I mean, let's be honest. Most of us are going to react the same way that those disciples had to have been reacting when they saw this woman. If a homeless woman comes in here and offers 2 pennies into the offering plate, are we really going to look at that woman and go, oh, thank you so much for your 2 pennies? No, we're going to be sitting there going like, 2 pennies? What are we going to do with 2 pennies? You know, you're supposed to be giving more than that. Surely you make more than that. And we might be in that same boat that the disciples and the Pharisees were in when Jesus was looking at them. But Jesus says, look, this woman gave everything she had in faith. This woman, for her to give those 2 pennies, took way more faith than for that Pharisee to give his 10%. Because that Pharisee is coming out of a place of significantly more wealth, and that 10% really doesn't mean that much to him. It means that he doesn't get to buy the yacht this year. He has to settle for the pontoon boat. But for this widow, those 2 pennies were everything. And she is the one who is leaving here blessed. Why? Because the purpose of giving is not to bless the temple. The purpose of giving is to bless the giver, to be able to show the giver that God is working through the gift. This is what we have to do. That is the first reason for giving. But let me suggest that there might just be a second reason for giving, a second purpose for giving, so that everyone is giving. And in order to do this, I have to do an illustration, and I am sorry for doing this illustration, but I have to do an illustration that's political, and I'm going to try not to take sides in the midst of this. But did anyone watch the Democratic National Convention? If you actually managed to sit through that whole speech, which I know some of you may not have been able to do that, at some point in the midst of that speech, Hillary Clinton goes, go to HillaryClinton.com and you can donate $5, $10, $15. Just go and donate and you can make a difference. Right now, Donald Trump and Mike Pence are trying to do this matching campaign thing. I don't know if you're in the midst of their campaign, but they have it where Donald Trump is saying, you guys donate, and if you can reach $2 million, I will match your donation to the campaign up to $2 million. They're both doing this. Why do they do that? Do you honestly think that Donald Trump can't write a check for $4 million? Instead of writing a check for $2 million and asking for donations for the other 2? Do you honestly think that $5 contribution to Hillary Clinton's campaign is going to do anything? If you do, I've got a bridge I can sell you out here. It's not going to do anything. That won't buy even a second of TV time. So why do they ask this? Why do they push this? Well, the reason is, if you donate to their campaign, no matter what the amount, If you donate to their campaign, you're more likely to donate again. You're more likely to get a sign and put it up in your yard. You're more likely to go out and actually vote come November because you're invested. You've now said, I want this person to be president, and I am actually sacrificing a little bit in order to try and make that person be president. That's why they want you to give those donations, so that you become invested in their campaign and their goal. I might suggest that giving to the church is similar. That no matter what it is you give, even if it's just 2 pennies, you're now invested in making sure that the church succeeds. You're now invested in making sure that the church does well. And maybe you'll give again. And maybe you'll give of your time if we need time. Maybe you'll be willing to come and pull weeds because you're invested in making sure this church thing, and specifically this church, happens. I hope I've made my point without angering too many of you. But the flip side is, this can be hard. And I know it can be hard. I'm, sad that Carolyn's not here, but at the same time, I'm kind of happy because she'd probably be sitting here going like, this is the most hypocritical sermon that he has ever given. Because I'll be honest with you, I fell away a little bit. And for the last year or so, ever since we found out we were going to have Caleb, I haven't been giving that well. I know how it happened. I know why it happened. You see, when we were in seminary, Jennifer and I were about $10,000 below the poverty line in what we made, even though we both worked 40-hour-a-week jobs. Go figure that one. We were both about $10,000 below the poverty line, and so we didn't wind up giving anything while we were going through seminary. But then I came out here. And my paycheck tripled. And all of a sudden, I had money. And so I gave that 10% right off the bat, and I gave that full tithe. But you know what? As I was reading through this book, I came across a survey that was in this chapter. And that survey asked a whole bunch of people. It said, are you satisfied with what you are making? About 90% of people said no, as you might expect. And so the second question of the survey was, if not, what amount would you need to make in order to be satisfied? And predictably, reliably, everyone answered 20% more than what they currently made. That did not matter how much they currently made. Everyone wanted to have 20% more. So if someone was making $10,000, they thought if they could just make $12,000, everything would be great. If they were making $20,000, if I could just make $24,000, everything would be great. If I was making $100,000, if I could just make $120,000, then everything would be great. You see, we spend what we make. And when we want something more, we figure, well, we need to make a little bit more money in order to get that. And sure enough, I wound up spending that tripled paycheck in various ways. And then we found out we were pregnant. And all of a sudden, I had to buy a crib. And I had to buy a stroller. And I had to buy food. And I was very good for the first couple of months. I was very good. And I said, no, this is sacred money. We can't touch that money. We got to find it somewhere else. But eventually I realized that there just wasn't anywhere else to get it. And so we bought this stroller, and we knew it was going to wind up coming out of the tithe. And I gave 8% that month. And you know what? The church didn't burn down when I got up to preach the next Sunday. And it became easier. And then it became 5%. And then, I'm sorry, it became only Grinnell. They need it more after all. And then it became nothing. Too easy to go in that direction, isn't it? And, I still gave. I would give in various little ways, things I would get that I wouldn't ask for reimbursements for. I would just consider, gifts to the church. But I can sit here and tell you what they were. They weren't 10%. And you know that. But as I read through this book, I tell you, it really edified me. And it didn't just edify me and didn't just convict me simply in the fact of you should be giving. I remember specifically the section of this chapter where he went through all the benefits you can get from giving, all the things that happen in your life as you give. And especially remember that he started talking about the fact that when you start to give away a little bit of your income, when you start to try and figure out how am I going to get to 10% giving away, what you begin to do is you begin to have to sit there with every single dollar you spend and say, am I spending this well? Or could I not buy this and give that dollar to God? And you begin to realize that every dollar you spend, even if it's a dollar you spent on rent or a dollar you spend on grocery food, a dollar you spend on things you know you need, you begin to realize it's God's money, not yours. And you begin to look at your life a little differently. There's a paradox in the midst of that, that as you give, you wind up feeling more secure. As you get less, you wind up feeling better. The flip side of that survey, the idea that everyone wants 20% more, is that someone who's making 80% of what you make thinks if they could just make what you make, then life will be great. And of course, what that indicates is that it isn't really about how much we make, it's about what we spend. Now, I know that this is like weight loss. It's really easy to go one way and really hard to go the other way. And I tell you right now, in the midst of my life, I don't have that 10% anymore. I'm going to have to try and find it. But what I do have is 2%. And so I'm pledging today I'm going to be giving 2%, and I'm going to be looking to figure out, can I give 3% next month and 4% the next month? And I'm going to work my way back, try and figure out some way to get there, like going on a diet. Work my way back to that 10% because you get stuff out of it. It helps you to give. And so I'm asking you today, if you're not tithing, to look towards working toward the tithe, unless you're above it. Don't try and... Good, thank you for still laughing. But if you're not tithing, join me in looking toward getting there. Even if that's 2% this year, 3% next year, 4% the year after that, towards getting in that direction. And the other thing I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to not give based on the church's need, but rather be in prayer and give based on what God is asking you to give. There's a significant difference in that. Because when we give as a church's need, we'll fill up the budget. And we'll do the budget, and we'll keep the lights on, and we'll keep the air conditioning on, and we'll keep the building maintained. But if we give as God is calling us, what will happen is not only will all that be covered, but when that random mission opportunity comes in, we will have randomly come up with that money, and we'll be ready to go. And so I'm asking you to look at giving in that way and see what God can do with you all, with even this church. You'll be amazed. May the words of my mouth and the blessings of all our hearts be acceptable to God. Amen.